It was her birthday. The daughter had gone out to dinner to celebrate. Her parents were watching the kids, 2 grandchildren, 9 and 5. It was a Wednesday afternoon in April, sunny, quiet. The kind of afternoon where nothing is supposed to happen. An 80-year-old neighbor was outside cutting his grass. He heard shots. He counted around 20. He saw a man in a black hoodie walk out of the house. And then he called 911. By the time deputies cleared that house on Marshall Road, they found 6 people who had been shot. 5 were already gone. Hey, welcome back. I need to talk about something that I genuinely could not let go of. I've covered a lot of cases, and most of them you find an answer. Maybe it's not a satisfying answer, but there's something. This one doesn't give you that. This one gives you 2 people who lived a quarter mile apart on the same road, who never, as far as anyone can tell, had a real conflict. And one afternoon, for reasons no one has ever been able to explain, one of them walked into the other one's home. And that was the end of everything. Rock Hill, South Carolina, April 7th, 2021. Stay with me, because there's a part of this story that most coverage completely missed, and it matters. Robert Leslie had been practicing medicine in Rock Hill since 1981. 40 years in the same town, treating the same families. He'd been the medical director of Rock Hill General Hospital's ER for nearly 15 years. Board certified in emergency medicine and occupational medicine. Masters in public health. He wrote a weekly medical column for the Charlotte Observer for 7 years, and he founded 2 urgent care clinics in the area. But here's the thing about Robert Leslie. None of that is what people remember first. What people remember is that he would walk through snow to treat a neighbor's sick kids, that he took patients as they were, that when he looked at someone in the ER at 2 in the morning, he didn't see a chart number. He saw a person. His literary agent said he had a charming personality that shone through the way he connected with patients, that he gave intriguing details that made him come across as deeply interested in the plight of the people he treated. He wrote about it a lot. He had about a dozen books published by the time he died. His first Angels in the ER sold over 250,000 copies. It was a collection of true stories from 25 years in the ER. Not grim, not cynical. Stories about hope, about what happens when people show up for each other in the worst moments. He wanted to take the fear out of going to the emergency room. That was his whole thing. He wanted people to know that someone was there for them. He wrote, "I know without a doubt that life is fragile." He wrote it in the context of hope, of faith, of gratitude. Keep that line in mind. We'll come back to it. He was 70 years old on April 7th. His wife, Barbara, was 69. They had been married 40 years, 4 children, 9 grandchildren. They lived on a forested plot on Marshall Road land with ponds, small buildings, animals, miniature horses, goats, donkeys, chickens, a lot of bees, a golden retriever named Moses. It was the kind of life that you build slowly over 40 years with someone you love. And that Wednesday, their daughter had gone out for her birthday dinner. So Robert and Barbara had the grandkids, Ada 9, Noah 5, 2 HVAC workers, James Lewis, and Robert Shook, both 38, were outside working on the heating and air conditioning unit. It was just a regular Wednesday. Now, about a quarter mile down Marshall Road, Philip Adams had grown up in Rock Hill, born here, raised here, in a town they literally called Football City, USA. Rock Hill has produced more NFL players per capita than almost anywhere. It's a point of pride. Kids grew up here dreaming about one thing, making it to the league. And Philip Adams made it, 7th round draft pick. San Francisco 49ers, 2010. He was the kid who proved it was possible. His high school coach called him the role model that all coaches hoped they could coach. He didn't drink. He didn't do drugs. Trained 3 times a day. A former Cowboys cornerback who trained him said he was a neat freak. Everything in his house precisely placed. In Rock Hill, his mother had been paralyzed in a car accident in 2009. Adams worked to support her. He was also a father to a young son. The people who knew him used words like precious, darling, quiet presence. A neighbor who had watched him grow up said, and I'm not paraphrasing, she was shocked to learn it was him. So that's who these 2 people were. A doctor who spent 40 years making sure people felt cared for, and a football player from the same town who just wanted to live a quiet life. A quarter-mile apart, and here's the connection between them, the one almost nobody talks about. The morning after the shooting, Adams's father, Alonzo, spoke to a local TV station. He said he thought football had messed his son up, and then, almost as an aside, he said something else. He said Dr. Leslie used to be his doctor, the family's doctor, a long time ago. The York County Sheriff confirmed it. He said Leslie was his own physician. Growing up, that Leslie was someone it seemed everyone knew. So these 2 families weren't strangers. Leslie had treated the Adams family at some point. And yet, no one has ever been able to explain why Philip Adams walked down that road on April 7th. That is the thing that stays with me. Now, let me tell you what happened to Philip Adams between the NFL and that afternoon, because this is the part that most coverage skips. His last NFL season was 2015, Atlanta Falcons. 6 teams in 6 seasons. He made it, but he never really stuck anywhere. Bounced, released, waived, re-signed, released again. In 2016, the Indianapolis Colts called his agent. They needed a cornerback. They wanted Adams on a flight to Indianapolis that night for practice. The next morning, Adams made it to the Charlotte airport. The flight had already left. His agent said, I could tell his head was not in it. He'd given up on it. That was effectively the end of his NFL career. He came back to Rock Hill, started volunteering as a coach at a local high school, told his agent he felt important again, that he was making a difference. But something was happening that nobody around him fully understood yet. In 2012, while playing for the Oakland Raiders, Adams took 2 concussions in 3 games. 2 in 3 games. The second time, he played the following week anyway. That's not unusual in the NFL. That's just Tuesday. But here's the part that matters. And this is the part nobody was watching at the time. Because Adams retired in 2015, not 2014, he was not eligible for the NFL's broad settlement with former players over concussion-related injuries. You had to have retired by 2014 to qualify. He missed it by 1 year. So he tried another route. In 2017, his agent connected him with Paul Scott, a former NFL executive who had spent years on the other side denying benefit claims on behalf of the league. Scott knew every piece of red tape the NFL used to reject applications. He'd written some of it himself. Adams wanted to apply for line-of-duty disability benefits. But to qualify, you needed your medical records from your teams. Adams couldn't get them. And then I need you to actually hear this part. When Adams tried to file disability claims directly with the NFL, he was denied. The reason? He couldn't remember things. He couldn't complete simple tasks, like traveling hours away to see doctors, like filling out the right paperwork in the right order. The NFL denied his claims because he couldn't function well enough to prove he couldn't function. You guys, his family later confirmed those exact deficits, the memory loss, the inability to handle basic tasks were almost certainly caused by the disease that was already destroying his brain. The system built a door and then made sure the people who needed it most couldn't open it. Hold that, because it gets worse. In 2019, Adams opened a smoothie shop in Rock Hill. He called it Fresh Life. And here's the thing. He refused to use his NFL career to market it. In Football City, USA, where your name on a jersey means everything, he didn't want it to be about that. He wanted to bring healthy food to a part of town that didn't even have a grocery store. He talked about starting a podcast about wellness, a mentorship program, teaching people a trade. His dream, the one he told his friend Tynetta, was to eventually grow his own food, to spend his days riding a tractor. She'd run the store, he'd just live. He was just wanting to live a very quiet life, she said. Then COVID hit. Fresh Life closed. And after that, the people closest to Adams started noticing things. His sister said his personality had shifted dramatically. He'd been laid back his whole life. All of a sudden, he had a temper. His hygiene started slipping. He was pacing around the yard. His father said he didn't talk much anymore, didn't bother nobody. He'd isolated himself, even from former teammates. His agent suspected his mental health was deteriorating, but said it wasn't something they discussed. You don't show pain. You don't show your emotions. He just wouldn't do it. He's from a football city, got an old school dad. He's not going to call anybody and say, hey, I'm hurting. That just wasn't his nature. The coroner later confirmed Adams had been complaining of excruciating pain, memory problems, couldn't sleep. In his parents' house, investigators would later find notebooks filled with cryptic writing, emblems, designs. The sheriff called it incoherent. He owned at least 9 firearms. And here's what I haven't told you yet. In December of 2021, 8 months after the shooting, Dr. Ann McKee at Boston University's CTE Center examined Adams' brain. Adams' family had donated it to research after his death. What she found was stage 2 chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, in both frontal lobes. And she didn't just say it was present, she said it was unusually severe for someone his age. She compared his brain to Aaron Hernandez, the Patriots tight end, who was convicted of murder and died in prison at 27. Same frontal lobe pattern, same severity. Stage 2 CTE is associated with aggression, impulsivity, paranoia, depression, memory loss. McKee said, I don't think he snapped. It appeared to be a cumulative progressive impairment. He was getting more paranoid, more forgetful, more impulsive, slowly, for years. And the 20 years he spent playing football definitely gave rise to that diagnosis. Those are her words. One study found signs of CTE in 110 of 111 NFL players examined. 110 out of 111. And yet, the settlement window closed in 2014. Adams missed it by 1 year. Now, April 7th, 4:46 in the afternoon, an 80-year-old neighbor calls 911. He'd been cutting his grass. He heard around 20 shots. He saw a man in a black hoodie walk out of the house carrying something under his arm. There were at least 2 people in the yard who had been shot, likely more inside. Robert Shook, one of the HVAC workers, married father of 3, was still alive when deputies arrived, still conscious, despite wounds that would eventually kill him 3 days later. He told officers a man had come out of the woods in camouflage pants and a black sweatshirt and just started shooting. One officer, driving to the scene, passed Adams on the road. Didn't know yet, just passed him. Inside the house, in a room at the back, Robert and Barbara Leslie, Ada, Noah, all 4 of them gone. James Lewis gone at the scene. Robert Shook gone 3 days later. 6 people. Adams left his phone at the scene. walked into the woods, drove home on an ATV, went into his parents' house, and didn't come out. For hours, law enforcement tried to negotiate, tried to communicate. No response. They sent a robot into the house to look for him. Just before 3 in the morning, they found him. Self-inflicted gunshot wound. Adams was 32 years old. His mother had been inside the house during the standoff. She was safely removed before the end. The sheriff stood at a press conference the next morning and said, "There's nothing about this right now that makes sense to any of us." And then he said something I keep coming back to. Sometimes we get to know the why. Sometimes we don't. There's one individual who knows the why, and he's deceased. We may never know. Not in any complete way. And I want to sit with that for a second, because I think the discomfort of not knowing is actually the point of this case. The Leslie family released a statement after the CTE results came out. They said, and I want to read this carefully, because it matters. Even in the midst of crushing heartbreak, we are finding some comfort in the CTE results and the explanation they provide for the irrational behaviors pertaining to this tragedy. They forgave him publicly, formally. The family of the people he killed, they forgave him, and they asked that any memorials be made to Camp Joy, the Center for Children with Disabilities that Robert had volunteered with for years. I don't know what to do with that. I genuinely don't. The Adams family also released a statement after the CTE results. We cannot say that we are surprised by these results. However, it is shocking to hear how severe his condition was. They said they hoped going public with the diagnosis would prevent other families from going through this. Philip is not the first to battle this disease. He will not be the last. 2 families, both destroyed by the same afternoon, both trying to find a way to make sense of it. Now, here's what happened after the case closed, because this part matters too, and most coverage stopped at the funeral. James Lewis, one of the HVAC workers, his father Tom, spoke out in 2023. He said he supports any lawsuit that creates changes to save lives. I don't want another family to go through this. I don't want somebody to lose somebody that they cherish and love because of something like this. And then he said, I not only lost my child, I lost my best friend. It has torn everybody up, and there's not a day that goes by that I don't think of him. Tom Lewis was also diagnosed with stage 4 liver failure that same year. A father who lost his son, now fighting his own body, still showing up to talk about it because he didn't want it to happen to anyone else. Holly Shook, Robert Shook's widow, filed a wrongful death lawsuit in December of 2021. A married father of 3, gone at 38, working a job just a Wednesday afternoon. And then there's this Alonzo Adams, Philip's father, filed a wrongful death lawsuit against South Carolina State University, the school where Philip played from 2006 to 2009. The lawsuit says the university failed to properly treat head injuries, failed to educate players about long-term damage, failed to train staff to identify and evaluate head trauma, and that those failures contributed directly to the CTE that destroyed his son's brain. The Adams family also sued the NFL. And here's where we are now. 5 years later, in 2026, a South Carolina judge allowed the case to move forward. The NFL tried to have it dismissed. The judge said no. The case is still active. The families are still waiting. Now, I want to talk about what this case is actually about, because I think it gets covered as a crime story or a CTE story or a gun violence story. And it's all of those things. But there's something underneath all of it. One study found CTE in 110 of 111 NFL players examined after death. 110 out of 111. The NFL has known about CTE as a serious risk since at least the early 2000s, they settled with former players for close to $1 billion in 2013. But the window closed in 2014. If you retired in 2015, like Philip Adams, you were on your own. And when Adams tried to apply for disability through the league, the disease that was destroying his ability to think clearly was also destroying his ability to navigate the paperwork required to prove it. Let me just say that plainly. The league built a system where the sicker you are, the less likely you are to successfully get help. That's not a bug. That's how the process works. And Philip Adams, a man who didn't drink, didn't do drugs, wanted to ride a tractor and grow his own food and feed his neighborhood, fell through every gap in that system. None of that excuses what happened on April 7th. Nothing does. Robert Leslie was 70 years old. He had spent 40 years showing up for this community. Barbara had been by his side for all of it. Out of us 9, Noah was 5. James Lewis was 38. A man whose father still thinks about him every single day. Robert Shook was 38, a husband, a father of 3, working a Wednesday afternoon. These were real people living real lives on a regular afternoon in April, and they deserved so much better than this. But here's the thing. I keep coming back to, if the system had worked, would that afternoon have gone differently? I don't know. Nobody knows. Dr. McKee herself said CTE is never the only factor, that it's complicated, that she can't say it alone caused what happened. But she also said this: we have seen this behavior. We have even seen homicidal behavior in individuals diagnosed with CTE. It is, in fact, not what I would consider unusual in this disease. Not unusual, and football players' odds of developing CTE may increase by as much as 30% per year of play. Adams started playing at 7 years old. 7. By the time he walked onto an NFL field, he had been taking hits to the head for over 20 years. The sport didn't cause what happened on Marshall Road, but something started long before that afternoon. And the people who built that sport, who profit from that sport, who watched Philip Adams get cut and waived and released and then go quiet, they are still here. The lawsuit is still active. And the answer to who is responsible for what is still being argued in a courtroom in South Carolina, I want to end where Robert Leslie ended. In Angels in the ER, the book he wrote about 25 years of watching people arrive broken and leave a little more whole. He wrote this: I know without a doubt that life is fragile. He wrote it about hope, about faith, about the people who showed up for strangers in their worst moments. He wrote it 40 years into a career spent trying to hold life together at the exact moment it was falling apart. And on a Wednesday afternoon in April, on his daughter's birthday, while the grandkids were over, while 2 workers fixed the heating unit outside, he found out exactly how right he was. Robert Leslie, Barbara Leslie, Ada, 9 years old, Noah, 5 years old, James Lewis, 38, Robert Shook, 38. This is who they were. This is who we lost. April 7th, 2021, Rock Hill, South Carolina.